My first guest is activist Felicity Ruby. Hi, Felicity.
Hi, everyone. Hello, Tim.
Hi. So what are you doing here? Why do you support WikiLeaks? What do you want us all to know about why you value WikiLeaks?
Well, I'm an Australian, and WikiLeaks it wasn't only invented here. It's given Australians a lot to think about. When I was working for Senator Scott Ludlam, a Green senator, we noticed that a publisher was being persecuted for publishing. We noticed that an initiative that started in Australia was having global significance. And we were very concerned when Australia's Prime Minister at the time of the Cablegate release and the Attorney General at that time threatened to not only take Julian's passport, but also alleged that WikiLeaks had conducted criminal activities in releasing the material. A Australian Federal Police inquiry found that to not be the case at all, that no Australian law was broken at that time. I believe that laws have been passed since then to ameliorate that situation from ever occurring again. But this seemed like a fantastically absurd response to a publisher publishing evidence of wrongdoing and evidence of leaders saying one thing in private and quite another thing in public. We noticed in the Cablegate was a pretty significant one for me because of where we were at the time. But the Rudd government, for example, in 2008, when Scott first became a senator, was talking very publicly about and predicting success in Australia's longest and still ongoing war, the war in Afghanistan. So he was predicting success and talking it up. But we learned from the cables that in private, he was saying to visiting US politicians that the national security establishment in Australia was very pessimistic about the long-term prognosis for Afghanistan. We learned many, many things about Australia and about our world from that moment on. And so in the substance of what you find in the WikiLeaks website, amazing material is there. But we also learned a lot about our polity, our parliament and our government in how it responded to those revelations. So I found that double kind of exposure was profoundly compelling and raised enormous questions for me about democracy and about what is the legitimate role of intelligence in a democracy. And can you come from a country like Australia, a Five Eyes country, and not try and think about what is done in the name of democracy by democracies when it comes to mass surveillance? And so from 6 long years of working for Scott Ludlam, during that whole time we were agitating and trying to raise awareness about these questions. I then went on to start my PhD, and one of my PhD case studies is WikiLeaks. And so why I care about WikiLeaks is because I actually care about a functioning democracy, and I think that it's something that we should be striving for and noticing when it is thwarted and retarded in its development. And I feel that WikiLeaks has given us incredible insights into power in our times, and I feel that the repressive response to those revelations, to the organization's publishing activities, has been so extreme, so incredibly brutal, that it shows that they're really onto something, that there is something profoundly new and important about the initiative of WikiLeaks and the activities and actions of Snowden and Assange and Manning, which have been discussed in a book that I've just finished reading that I highly recommend. It's called The Art of Revolt. and it's by a Frenchman whose name is a bit difficult to pronounce. The Art of Revolt: Assange, Manning, and Snowden. And he talks about the fact that when something new comes along, when some new initiative or profoundly new way of doing things comes along, we sometimes don't notice it. We can only see it in the repertoire of actions and activities that have gone before it. But when we jump off the cliff into something quite new, we don't often notice it at first. But he alleges, and he makes a very strong case as to why the disruption to media, to politics, to protest that WikiLeaks has brought us is in part explained as a new and very profoundly important thing by how repressive the response has been. So because I feel that it's so asymmetrical, the response to WikiLeaks, and the experience of Assange is just, it's so appalling on so many levels. So I feel compelled to support him and to support the publication, and for which I have lost many friends, and for which I have been in very many arguments with very many people over very many silly details. And then every now and then I manage to convince someone and to show them how intense the campaign has been to befuddle our minds and to hijack our minds and thinking with arguments and words that are designed to stop us thinking. And of course, as a feminist and as a rape survivor, discussing the Swedish allegations was a big preoccupation for many years. And now those allegations and investigation, not charges, I might add. Lawyers seem to not be able to not say the word charges, which drives me absolutely manic, but we are in unity for Jay, so I won't say anything nasty about lawyers. You know, the allegations and the investigation of Sweden has stopped now, and so we can kind of stop having that discussion, can we? Well, seemingly not. Now we're talking much more about the efforts to thwart and stop a publisher from publishing, which, you know, invites us to think a lot about press freedoms. It's a long intro. There you go. That's why I'm here.
No, that's excellent. Yeah, it's very interesting that by so aggressively shutting down WikiLeaks on all fronts, across all mass media platforms, across all governments, they're actually proving Assange's thesis correct. They're proving the necessity of WikiLeaks. The fact that there would be such draconian, aggressive shutting down of someone who is simply publishing fact, and just completely unvarnished fact, tells you that there actually does need to be some way of holding these power establishments to account. Yeah.
Exactly, and the fact that people still keep trusting WikiLeaks and providing information to the platform, to this outlet, shows that kind of need, it's fulfilling a need that's that it's providing something that people need. I think that you know, I just want to run through some of the things that we've learned about Australia, if that's okay, because I think that
yes, please,
a lot of people are interested in supporting Julian, and as am I, and WikiLeaks, but they don't spend enough time. Kind of like, the best way, I think, to support WikiLeaks is to honour the sacrifices that people have made to make material available by looking at the material. Go to the website, be curious about something, do a word search. It's so easy to find out so much. I sometimes liken, you know, people wanting to talk about WikiLeaks constantly and not actually using the platform, using the material, as like buying all of the AC/DC albums in the world and just never playing them, just looking at the covers. They're quite nice covers, but like, the point is to play the music, right? So the point of WikiLeaks is to look at the material, to dive in. It's like this Library of Alexandria, and people are just going to the gift shop. They're not going to the actual library. And this is what actually drives me a little bit bonkers. And it feels like such an insult to the sacrifice that's been made. So I just want to like show some of the trove that's in here about just my stupid little country down here in North Antarctica. So, you know, one of the things that we learned when Scott was sitting in the Senate was that just a few seats away from him was sitting a protected source of the United States government. who provided valuable insider information over many years. So that was a guy called Mark Arbib, who was a senator, but he wasn't the only source. We found out that, from the WikiLeaks website, that Michael Danby, Bob Hawke, and even Foreign Minister Bob Carr, also known as Boob Carr, also known as Bob Carr, regularly provided insights about the inner workings of their sad and tepid, gossipy party to the United States government. So that's someone sitting in the Senate and they're representing, you think, their state in the Australian Parliament, but actually they're a protected source for the United States. We learn from the material on WikiLeaks how Australian diplomats weakened the cluster munitions treaty. So Australia insisted on a loophole that allowed signatories to cooperate with military forces that were still using cluster munitions, which is, in Australia ran these sock puppet arguments on behalf of the United States, just undermining the very objectives of the treaty itself, which was just this stunning betrayal of anyone who hoped to protect civilians from this brutal and indiscriminate long-lasting weapon. So Australia was in there, and we have this insight into how our government works when it's running around the United Nations, supposedly trying to, work on arms control treaties, and in fact, they're undermining them. We find out about super injunctions, issued by our courts. So this was in 2014. It was a very, very high level corruption case, in Australia, involving past and current heads of state of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Now, reporters weren't allowed to cover it. And so citizens weren't allowed to know that, 7 executives of subsidiaries of our Reserve Bank were indicted on allegations in providing millions of inducements for contracts to supply Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam with polymer banknotes. So this super injunction was this, huge corruption case that we only knew about because of WikiLeaks. Of course, in the treatment of Julian, we've learned that the Consular Services Charter in Australia is just totally inconsistently applied. Some Australians that have faced trouble overseas get support and others just don't. So when we saw ICC lawyer, Australian citizen, marvellous woman, Melinda Taylor, in trouble overseas, was arrested in Libya on, ridiculous charges while she was doing her job as an ICC lawyer representing her client. Well, what happened? Our foreign minister got on his white steed, got on a plane, went to Libya, spat out another passport from a printer for her and yanked her out, got her home. Others, other people are kind of deemed enemies of the state and left to rot. So we've learned that about Australia. We've learned that, foreign ministers just make shit up. They just make shit up. Bob Carr, he got away with it. He got away with saying lies. He bragged in his memoir, the idiot, about lying to the Australian media, to the public, and to the Parliament. So he lied and then bragged about it in his book, saying that Assange had received more consular assistance than any other Australian. Now, that got repeated a lot. And why did Boob Carr do that? He said that because he was irritated, he says in his memoir, and he was annoyed by Julian's mother, his distressed mother, advocating on behalf of her son. He chose to punish her and to punish Julian by saying something that was printed countless times from every outlet, and then in his memoir admitted that he didn't know that was true, and he made it up. Unbelievable. During the time when Boob Carr was the foreign minister, Scott was in the Parliament, and we had a couple of conversations with him, and I ended up drafting a few letters, one of which was, I think, 8 pages long, because it included 17 pieces of evidence about the fact that there was a grand jury investigation. He kept saying there was no such thing, and how do we know? We provided many examples of people citing the existence of the grand jury, including people under oath at the Manning trial, stating that it existed. So he stopped, to his credit, saying that. What else have we learned? We learned some stuff about FOI. So Scott and I tried to, under freedom of information, find out queries about WikiLeaks and Assange and how much the government was following them. So in petitioning the defense, the Foreign Affairs and Trade Ministry about his situation, we kind of discovered that the FOI machine is totally broken. So DFAT utilised every single opportunity that they could to delay, maximum delay that they could. At each procedural step, they get to sort of re-trigger the delay mechanism. So it took 7 months for DFAT to provide such a huge amount of trivia and blank paper and blacked out paper, and including documents in the public domain, including Scott's own questions on notice that they had redacted. So stuff that we
They redacted public domain?
They redacted his own Senate motions. And so then when Scott complained to the commissioner, the information commissioner did write back and said there were significant failings in DFAT. He acknowledged that DFAT did not adhere to the FOI Act, and that the DFAT FOI office was operating on an incorrect understanding of the FOI Act. So the commissioner found these 3 things. They were pretty serious, that DFAT's FOI office wasn't doing what it should do. And the commissioner said that there must be procedural change in DFAT about it. So, okay, fine. But actually there was no fault found. So they did stuff that was serious enough to precipitate procedural change, but not for fault to be found. And so by characterising these things as accidental, the commissioner actually, basically gave rise to a conclusion that the strategy of frustrating FOI requests is baked so deeply into the organisational culture of DFAT that there's just no point in trying. So it's just simply how things are done. There are so many other great examples of things that are in the material. I could go on and on. I don't know. Do you want to hear some more? There's plenty. Plenty of ways.
By all means. That's your wheelhouse.
Yeah. Look, in March 2009, we got some more documents. The Australian Defence Force Classified Propaganda Doctrine. Fascinating document. It's dated 20th of June 2001. And it documents how public information and perception management and offensive IO, information ops, psychological operations and propaganda is used by the Australian Defence Force. There's an extract on how the Defence Force works to influence Australian public opinion. Here it is. Public information,
it's used domestically.
PI, yeah. Public information, PI, is information that's released or published for the primary purpose of keeping the public fully informed. Thanks so much, guys. Thereby gaining their understanding and support. In times of tension and conflict, the maintenance of Australian domestic support and an understanding of ADF operations are of great importance to the maintenance of the national effort. Okay. Should the Australian public lose confidence in the ability of the ADF to bring a conflict to a successful conclusion, restraints may be placed on the government and the ADF. In a low-level conflict, the result of loss of public confidence could include an unwillingness on the part of the civilian population to continue to deny the adversary achieving its aims, withdrawal of active support to authorities, and a perception by the international community of the political weakening of Australia's resolve. So this, so the ADF, media releases, media tours, media interviews, photo opportunities and trips are not necessarily provided for democratic transparency and oversight, but they're about sort of maintaining the national effort and to avoid restraints being placed on government and ADF. So, I don't know.
Wow. So that was 2001. Let me think.
Yeah.
What else happened in 2001,
Yeah, there is that. I mean, another great thing, this was a great helpful thing, was when WikiLeaks provided the secret ACMA internet censorship blacklist. And this was released on March 2009. And actually the document was dated March 2009. So someone really wanted WikiLeaks and the public to have this so that we could know. So this was at the height of the debate about a mandatory internet filter in Australia. And so WikiLeaks published the blacklist of lots of websites that had been secretly banned by the Australian government authority, ACMA. So this was a case of a timely release that fed a debate that was occurring about a really important policy issue. So ACMA proposed at that time fines of about 11,000 a day for linking to a site on this secret, unreviewable censorship blacklist, a list that the government hoped but failed to expand into a giant national censorship machine. And so, this effort to keep internet freedom is an ongoing fight. Um, but those, but that release at that time also showed things like, an optometrist, I think it was listed on there accidentally, but this is the kind of problems with some of those blacklists. Another one that I really like is the Rudd government 1 year on report. And so this was something that was released in 2011 and it was dated 2008. And so this was a diplomatic cable in which Australians learned that the US regards Prime Minister Rudd as making a number of missteps when he was the foreign minister, describing him as making snap announcements without consulting other countries or within the Australian government. Under a subheading, Rudd, the control freak, we read that there's been a persistent criticism from senior civil servants, journalists and parliamentarians that Rudd is a micromanager, obsessed with managing the media cycle rather than engaging in collaborative decision-making. I mean, none of this was a big, huge surprise to us, actually. But it was interesting to read about the policy paralysis that the US was taking quite a close interest in and in understanding our new Prime Minister and measuring his strengths and his weaknesses. There's many more. One of the ones that was really hard for me to read was dating right way back. So what's been fantastic about the cables in particular is how far they go back. So you can read a lot about what was going on in the 70s, what was going on around, the constitutional crisis here in Australia where our government was removed in 1975. In 1975, there was a big debate within the ALP about the US alliance, about Pine Gap, about bases in Australia and whether they contributed to our security or made us a nuclear target. And at the time, the Labor Party still had this strange, sinewy stuff called a backbone. And they did stand up and they did ask questions and they were an opposition. And So in 1975 at the ALP state national conference, Whitlam spoke against folks in his party who were trying to close Pine Gap. So Whitlam said at the time, "You must trust us. These are not our secrets to disclose." One paragraph of his statement, which was it was unusual for him because he was standing up and asking questions about Pine Gap a lot. But one of the paragraphs of the cable reads, "In referring to Pine Gap and Woomera, the Prime Minister said that he, the Defence and Foreign Minister and others with a need to know are fully informed on what's going on. The Australian government has access to both facilities." This speech by Whitlam had been cleared by the US mission before it was given to his own party. That's sad. That saddened me a lot. It wasn't he himself who'd cleared it. It was people in DFAT who, like, without him knowing, but they'd cleared that statement and they were it was very effective and most welcome, they said, when Whitlam pushed back against his own party. So,
Yikes.
There's so many of the things that were revealed to us by WikiLeaks that kind of, something that Julian talks about sometimes is that, the day before Snowden's revelations, the day after, the day before Manning's revelations, the day after, the world changed. The world was a different place. We understood it completely differently. One day we didn't know anything about NSA spying much that we could confirm, that we had evidence for. The next day we did. It changes the world. So I feel like if you just look closely at just one country or one issue, you can see how WikiLeaks has just raised the veil of secrecy, so that we can understand our world better. We can actually engage with the institutions with clear and open eyes, as opposed to blindly stumbling around, not quite understanding the power dynamics of our world. These opaque government agencies and private surveillance industries, and our own perceived role in the world, then we do need to understand the powers that are pressing upon Australia and that actually drive and dictate a lot of our policies. Our place in the world, and some of it's embarrassing, some of it's infuriating, and some of it's pretty fucking alarming. But the more we understand and the more we talk about it and the more we write about it and the more we think about it, the more we're likely to be able to evolve. It's kind of as simple as that in a way.
Yeah, you keep the word foreign keeps coming up over and over again as you talk about all the things that you've learned from your research in Australia related WikiLeaks documents. And it's just over and over and over again, copious amounts of evidence that Australia does not have nearly the amount of sovereignty that it is believed to, that most Australians probably believe that it has. And if you don't have, if the people, the voting populace doesn't have any control over foreign policy at all, apparently it seems like it has some over domestic, but foreign policy, virtually none. You can't really call it a proper democracy. You're not giving the people rule over any over Australia's place in the world and how it interacts with other nations. Can I just pause? We need to pause for just a few seconds. Our tech team wants to switch streams. Okay, they'll let us know when it's done.
Okay. Okay, it looks like we're go.
We're good?
Yeah.
Is it up?
Yes, I think so. So yeah, you were just saying that it's very difficult to have an independent foreign policy or a sovereign nation without being able to kind of, you know, control or dictate your own terms and your own, priorities in the world. Just recently, well, not recently, in September 2016, there was a protest at Pine Gap, which is one of the biggest US surveillance facilities in the world and definitely the biggest in Australia. And a bunch of folks went to protest and to raise their voices to mark the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Pine Gap Agreement. And at that protest, 6 faith-based folks got arrested, and they ran a court case at rather great risk. They risked going to jail for 7 years for penetrating Pine Gap with prayer, I like to say, with rattles and flowers and musical instruments. These incredibly peaceful and polite people played some music in Pine Gap and were arrested, and for which they faced 7 years in jail. Hard to, make these links. The government went very hard for this. It was 4 months after the protest that the Attorney General gave authorization for these people to be charged. It's a very serious thing, a symbolic protest to become possibly going to jail for 7 years. And despite the state pressing very, very hard, those people just got small fines and told to go away. The government very much wanted years in jail. They said, we don't want the full 7 years, but we want them to go down for years, because they wanted to deter people asking questions about Pine Gap. But the court case that ensued focused very much on the drone strikes that are targeted through Pine Gap. And Pine Gap does many, many, many things, and it has more and more real-time battlefield relevance in communications and in targeting. So 3 drone strikes per day are done through Pine Gap, the plaintiffs to this case were alleging. And it was amazing to see a jury listening to the former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Fraser, saying exactly what these protesters were saying, exactly the kinds of concerns, that this actually undermines Australian sovereignty if events are going on, that 3 death strikes, extrajudicial assassination are occurring from our soil. We are complicit. We are complicit. There's blood on our hands. We have to actually be better at this. And in one breath, the government says, we have full knowledge and concurrence of what's going at Pine Gap. Well, fine. Then you are partly responsible for extrajudicial killing. And it's not okay. And Australians get to say something about it. But actually, if you try to say something about it, if you try to turn up and have an opinion about Pine Gap, you are placed under quite a great deal of surveillance. And for a symbolic and very, very peaceful protest, you risk going to jail for 7 years. So it's very difficult to raise issues and to raise awareness around secrecy around what is this is very hard to research. As a PhD student, it's very hard to research, profoundly secret agreements and facilities. But also as a citizen, it's very difficult to stand up and have an opinion about foreign policy decisions that are made in the dark and behind closed doors and deep within US military facilities. So again, this is the kind of the questions that WikiLeaks has helped us make sense of and helped us form in asking questions about democracy and how we're going to have peace if we continue to feed this enormous war machine and this enormous surveillance machine that go hand in hand more and more.
Yeah, the WikiLeaks school of what's going on in the world and the world that they teach you about in standard public school couldn't be more different, really. It's night and day. You said earlier, I wanted to trace back to this, you said that the best thing people can do to support WikiLeaks is go through the actual documents. And you said, you mentioned keyword search. I think that's probably a good idea for us to get out to viewers. That's a really important message. Can you describe how you have used that function and what your experience is with it? Give us your sales pitch to our audience for that technique.
Yeah, look, I think that the WikiLeaks website is it can be quite overwhelming, like the Library of Alexandria of the most dangerous and repressed documents. That's been quite overwhelming for people to just try and get their heads around, but I encourage people to just throw in someone's name. So my best friend is a 95-year-old woman called Edith, and she's been active for a really long time. And I thought, I wonder if Edie's in there. Boom. Yes, she is. Because in the 70s, 1977, in Geneva, she organised with quite a few other people this amazing gathering of indigenous people from Las Americanas to come to the UN, and this meeting actually triggered what became the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. But it was a gathering of people from many, many, many nations came to Geneva and learned from each other and discussed and formed bonds and demands and so this is 1977. And so the cable about that organising, also, I'm writing a book about her and I'm trying to, learn about the significance of these kinds of organising around the UN in Geneva. And there it was, this write-up of what these activists were doing. Fascinating. You also go, I used to, the reason I was born used to be, getting rid of nuclear weapons, and that was what I did. And I was involved in every meeting that I could go to of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it's a tedious old treaty, but it's the only place where the nuclear weapon states are legally bound to the obligation to eliminate nuclear weapons. So meetings around the NPT, fascinating. So what did I find? I found all these notes of prior to NPT meetings that I had been part of. I saw the démarche notes. So that a démarche is when a government sends all their diplomats to go and speak to the governments of the countries where they have embassies. And so the position of the United States from, for the NPTs was laid bare. And I could see, how the forces of peace and nuclear disarmament were up against this machine and what its terms were. Fascinating. So that was just by, on the front page of the website, chucking in a search term and seeing what was there and ploughing through a bit and being prepared to go to the third and the fourth and the fifth page of search results that come up and learning how, you can actually just select which archive you want to search through. You can look through the diplomatic cables, or you can look through just the Syria files, or you can look through 3 or 4 of the collections. If you want to understand about the dangers to do with cyber weapons in our times, there's an enormous archive called Vault 7 that you can go to, and you can understand the ways in which weaponized code, cyber weapons, like they keep tacking the word cyber onto things and expecting us to get what they mean. I resist that quite a lot. But when it comes to cyber peace and cyber weapons, I want to use it because I think that it's increasingly relevant, that the internet itself is being militarized and code is being introduced to disrupt the critical infrastructure that is now connected to the internet. So much of our civilization, our ports, our transportation system, our communication system, so much of how we do business and our lives and our education is on the internet. So if you start to disrupt that with weaponized code, you're really playing with fire, and it's a disaster. And it's amazing what kind of silly things that have been created by the CIA to hurt the internet. And it's silly because it's suicidal in many respects, because the US is one of the most integrated to the internet economies, and they have so much themselves to protect, and releasing weapons, a disaster. So I really care about that. I really want the internet to not blow up. And so looking at the Vault 7 release was fascinating in terms of what's going on, and the US isn't the only country that's developing these weapons. So that word search, is quite user friendly, and it's designed to look like what. Of course, we don't use what anymore. We all use DuckDuckGo, but it does actually. It's that easy. You chuck in anything that you're curious about, and you'll find it. And the thing is, like a lot of people in the US in particular are not allowed to look at the WikiLeaks website. So it is an act of resistance to dare to be curious and to go and see what you can find, and you will be amazed at what you can find about so many issues. It's really quite an amazing archive, and while we still have it, while it's still mirrored and protected and hardened so that we can look at it, I think we really should.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. You brought up how just people you've known from your life in activism and your friends you've found stuff on. So, we'll see the WikiLeaks Twitter account share documents from whatever pertinent current event is coming up. If there's stuff going on in Syria, they'll say, hey, look at this, WikiLeaks cable from 2006 or whatever about something that happened in Syria. But also anything that's touched your life personally, in your community, in your online in your online activism, any particular kind of vaguely obscure cause that you've run into, there could be a WikiLeaks document out there, and it's totally worth checking for. It's a pretty easy system to use.
Someone who I respect quite a lot, Cynthia McKinney, she did her PhD and wanted to include reference to documents that provided evidence and backing for some of her theories and her work. She was instructed that she had to strip her PhD of any reference to WikiLeaks. We know that the main academic journal, there's I wish I could remember, I should have looked it up. The main academic journal publisher in the United States will not allow any reference to WikiLeaks cable, any WikiLeaks document, any document to be found on WikiLeaks cannot be referred to in the main, foreign affairs academic journal. There's 5 journals under this rubric of the Political Studies Association, I think. This gagging, it's quite remarkable how Cynthia McKinney, her academic pursuit of knowledge was curbed from using the documents, and how intellectuals, academics, the biggest archive of documents relating to American foreign affairs is available on WikiLeaks, and academics aren't allowed to actually engage with it. That's amazing. That is, I think,
crazy.
It shows again how endangered these documents are, but also how much of a deterrent that has been put in place to stop people looking at them, to stop people learning. So I feel like that's the barbed wire fence to climb over first. And then you'll see, in action, in evidence in front of you, tangible, in your experience, you'll see the value of being able to be curious and to rove around in the raw documents. Something that Julian says that I think is very true is that some publications seek to privatize or own or hog or hold at bay the raw material, whereas if it becomes publicly available, Everybody, journalists, but also lawyers, also police, also activists, also people who are expert, subject matter experts can dive in. By privatizing and holding back these archives, it's actually an act of real arrogance to think that you and you alone and your publication alone can derive all of the meaning and benefits from an archive. In fact, it's by democratizing the eyes on it that you can actually get the full benefit from the information available, and all the dots can start to line up in whole different ways to create some kind of coherent analysis. And I think that's really true. I think that that kind of knowledge cumulatively loads, and that the kind of understanding of events in our times cannot just be through one prism. That there's actually great benefit to be derived in opening up these things and allowing many eyes to examine them.
Yeah, we don't think enough, and whenever there's like a major WikiLeaks drop or something, or people talk about the ones that really change the way people think about stuff, but they don't think as much about like the fact that WikiLeaks exists forces these institutions to be honest. And on the other side of the spectrum, that's what you're talking about, the self-censorship. There's all this stuff that's happening that individuals and the citizenry, as well as institutions and power establishments, are forced to do that nobody really talks about and doesn't get shown very much. But everything from people choosing not to visit WikiLeaks because of some drop that offended them or something, and they think it makes them a bad person, all the way up to universities censoring consumption of the documents that doesn't get noticed as much.
Yeah, no, exactly. We don't have much time left because you're going to be interviewing someone else next, so I should say a couple of things about how much I miss Julian these last months. I am someone who sometimes yells at Julian to shut the fuck up on Twitter, actually, I have to admit. And so it's a bit like Michelle Grattan unable to say the word green, or the Fonz unable to say the word sorry. It's actually a little bit remarkable that I should say I really, really miss him on Twitter, because I think some of the stuff he tweets is fucking ridiculous and he really makes me angry. But he also has an incredible insight, and his analysis and what he notices, and the quirky ways in which he is informed by all the stuff that he's read. It is an actual loss, and I hope that when he comes back onto Twitter, we will have less arguments and enjoy more of his of his insights, because I think that they're pretty acute and pretty interesting most of the time. What's happening to him is, I remember so very well the day that Ecuador gave him asylum, and I was very happy that had happened, because that was the right thing to do. But I was also like deeply, deeply ashamed that the reason that Ecuador gave him asylum is because he was without the support of his country of origin. And that is so true, that Australia has completely abandoned this citizen. So it's always been a great sense of gratitude and awe at that small country. I've been to Ecuador several times. It's a small country, and it's a proud and diverse and interesting country, very much so. But what courage to stand up and on a matter of principle, on a matter of law, and a matter of seriously examining the facts. Asylum is not given on a whim. Asylum is given after serious examination. And believe me, there was a lot of information put in front of Ecuador for that asylum case. And so there he is, benefiting from the courage of a small nation that's prepared to stand up on a matter of principle. And then there is a change of government, and there is change in his treatment. And I really wish that Ecuador would return to its first principles, and to the reasons that it made the decision to give Julian asylum. I'm very glad that they've given him citizenship as well. Again, it was a mixed joy and a mixed sense of shame and just real horror that Australia is so hopeless that Ecuador needs to also give him not just asylum but citizenship. So I really call on Ecuador to let his voice ring out again, and to let that person receive visitors, because he misses me. He wants an argument. I'm sure he needs to have an argument with me. I'm sure he needs to have a discussion with Vivian. I'm sure there's many people who he would like to have a fight with and to have a discussion with. He's got a incredibly interesting and hungry mind, and I feel that it's a really terrible diet to go on, to only speak to fucking lawyers. Like, he really needs to not just speak to lawyers. He needs human beings and people who love him. And I feel like that I really, really, really hope not only that Ecuador will let him back on Twitter, but I hope that the negotiations result in him being free, and that the persecution of a publisher for publishing can cease. And I desperately want him to come home. I desperately, desperately want him to come home. I don't know if he'll ever be able to do that, but I would like him to hear the kookaburras that I hear, and I'd like him to meet my pet wallaby, fat bastard. And there's all kinds of things that I want him to see and hear again as an Australian. I was out gardening today under the sun. It's been 7 years since that guy's seen proper sun. And I, with all my heart, want him home. And I want, to continue our ongoing arguments about many issues, but also to see the truth keep rolling out on the WikiLeaks website. So thank you so much for everybody who's been part of organising this vigil. I think it's a sign of the strong support that's out there around the world for WikiLeaks and for Julian, and our heartfelt hope and our determination that this situation must end. It must end. It cannot continue.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's definitely, we will know that we are living in a much healthier world if we're able to have tea with Julian in Australia someday. That will be probably a key sign that we have arrived at where we want to be. And we still have a couple more minutes. Is there?
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, there's just what, I want to notice that our current Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, was the lawyer for the Snowden of his day. He was the lawyer for Peter Wright, who was a MI5 sort of retired MI5 guy who wanted to publish a book called Spycatcher. And Malcolm Turnbull ran a brilliant case. It had Maggie Thatcher screaming at bloody murder in the Parliament in the UK because she was so grumpy. He got Whitlam on the stand to talk about the Five Eyes. It was just this amazing, creative, interesting case. And of course, he won. He was victorious. And his book about the case talks a lot about democratic principles and about the freedom of the press and the fact that information, that the intelligence agencies that are part of democratic states should also be accountable to people. Like, it's a very good rave that Malcolm writes. And then you fast forward a couple of decades, and now he is the guy who knows better, right? He knows better. Passing laws, his government has put together laws that would actually criminalise WikiLeaks publishing here in Australia. They just went through the Senate last week, all under the guise of stopping foreign interference. He is undoing so many of the press freedoms and civil liberties in this country when he knows better. When he knows better. Malcolm Turnbull knows better, and he needs to do better. He needs to step up and do a lot better than he is. Well, in fact, he could just go, really. But I just think that this is incredible that the Prime Minister that we have now was the defender of the Snowden of his day, and is now, the arch abandoner-in-chief of an Australian citizen, and it's unacceptable, and it has to stop. A letter was delivered to the Foreign Ministry by Julian's father and Greg Barnes, who you've heard from on this cast. So there's lots of activities happening here, not enough, but hopefully more, and hopefully help Malcolm Turnbull step up again and, I don't know, get a brain transplant and remember what he used to know. I think we have to go. I think we're being told that's it.
That would be beautiful.
Thanks
Felicity
a lot,
Ruby,
Tim.
thank you
Thanks a lot,
so
everybody.
much.
No problem.
Really
Thanks.
appreciate
Bye.
it. Thank you.